Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Ellen Ingmanson. I'm an anthropologist from Bridgewater State University, and I'm talking to you today about some of my field observations on the great apes. I thought I would start by telling you how Darwin is related to anthropology. A lot of people know that anthropology is part of the study of being human. And people think about culture and different lifestyles and different kinds of behaviors, but they don't always recognize that biological anthropology is a subpart of anthropology. And in this, we study the modern human variation, including genetics. We look at paleoanthropology and we study the fossils and what they can tell us about what it means to be human. And we also study primatology, the study of the apes and the monkeys and the lemurs, and what it tells us about how we are human and what we're not, and how they are so closely related to us, and yet what makes us uniquely human. So evolution and natural selection are really integral parts of being an anthropologist and understanding what it means to be human. My specialty is primatology, and so that's what I will share with you. We should look at what makes a primate, something that all primate species share together. This includes the lemurs, the monkeys, the apes, and us too. We are primates. We all have these forward-facing eyes, and so that our eyes look towards the front. They're not on the side of our head the way, say, a horse's eyes would be. This gives us an advantage in that we can see in 3 dimensions, really important when you're leaping around in the trees. Our eyes are also protected by bone in the skull of our cranium, so that our eyes being brought forward, and they're so important to us that they're given extra protection. That opposable thumb, so important in primates. It allows us to do things like grasp onto the trees when we're climbing. It allows us to pick up things, means that we can hold on to other things. We can groom each other with our hands. We can manipulate our food and take it apart. We can make and use tools. All of these things we see in the apes and in most of the other primates. Primates have big brains. Compared to other animals, the size of our body, our brains are quite big. All primates' brains are. This has an important implication because it means that primates have a lot of learning that they can do. Our brains allow for learning. They give us access to learning. And primates live a long time. In the apes, we're talking 40 to 45 years. Monkeys can live to be 30 years old. So there's time for learning, and the importance of learning is really emphasized. Primates eat all kinds of different things, from fruit and insects, leaves, grass, and meat, so that there's quite a varied diet. We see all of these things in ourselves as well. Where do we find primates? Anywhere in the tropical part of the world for the most part. So in South America and Central America, we find monkeys. In Africa, we find monkeys as well as apes. We find lemurs in Madagascar. There are bush babies that are prosimians in the central part of Africa. In Southeast Asia, we find many kinds of monkeys. We find tarsiers, we find lorises, and we find the apes as well. And so there are lots of different places in the world where we find primates. I study predominantly the apes, and those are found in Africa as well as in Asia. And those are the areas I've traveled to most. We don't find any apes here in North or South America, unless we've brought them into captivity, of course. So the great apes, those are what I'm going to talk about. My research is long focused on the great apes, and this is the family Hominidae. It includes the Asian apes, or the orangutans, the red ape of the forest, they're sometimes called. Look at him hanging here from this branch. We have in Africa then the chimpanzees, and we have gorillas. There's different species of both chimpanzees and gorillas, and they live in different areas, and sometimes they behave differently as well. Apes are the largest of all of our primates, and they're the most intelligent. Their intelligence is more like human intelligence than it is like monkey intelligence. And so while we tend to think of monkeys as being particularly intelligent, the apes surpass them, and they're much more closely related to us. They're very long-lived. As I said a moment ago, up to 45 years in the wild. In captivity, such as in a zoo, they can live to be 50, 60 years old. But in the wild, 45 is usually as old as they get. Offspring are really very dependent on their mothers. This is part of that learning. The mothers will nurse them for several years. The infants will stay then with their mother. They go through a juvenile period, and maybe even as adults, they'll come back and visit with their mother at times. That bond between offspring and their mothers is very, very strong. We find that the apes have very large canines. So if they open their mouths and look at you, it can be intimidating. And that's part of their purpose. They live in social structures where they are in competition with each other. They need to intimidate each other. Some of them, like chimpanzees, actually hunt other animals for food. And so they use their canines then as well. They have high sexual dimorphism. This means that males and females can be of different sizes. In orangutans, males are twice the size of females or more. Gorillas, it's the same. The male is much larger than the female is. And that's because they're competing with each other, the males are, in order to have access to females. And so the larger they are, the more females they can get. When they're walking on the ground, they often will knuckle walk or on their fists. When they're up in the trees, they swing by their arms, such as this little orangutan right there. And we find that the apes all build nests at night. Monkeys don't do that. Monkeys tend to sleep sitting up. They might sit on a branch, they huddle together, but apes build nests. And a mother and her offspring, her small offspring, will sleep together in a nest. By the time they get to be juveniles, they have to build their own nests, but they'll sleep together, but several will be in the same tree potentially. They build a new nest every single night. And every single one of these apes is an endangered species. Some of them very, very endangered. Others have a few more individuals, but still extremely threatened. When you go out into the field, you always have questions that you want to answer, and your research across your lifetime is shaped by particular questions. My research questions for my entire career has really centered around intelligence. As an anthropologist, I'm interested in human intelligence, but I do it through the lens of looking at non-human primates so that I can help understand what human intelligence is about. So one of the first questions is to ask, what is intelligence? And that's not easy to answer. But I'm also interested then in how it has evolved. We've gone through many different stages where intelligence was less than it is today. Why is it where it is today? How did it get there? How do the apes show intelligence? What methods do they use? How do we know that they're intelligent? What special adaptations do they have? And does their intelligence differ from each other? And that means I need to compare them. And so I've had the opportunity to be in the field and see most of the different species of great apes at one time or another, and to be able to compare them. If they're different, why are they different? We do find that particularly in the wild, gorillas are different from chimpanzees, orangutans are different from both of them. In captivity, we find that they can do a lot of the same things, but in the wild, we see very different things going on. And so the role of the environment is very important. What kinds of foods they're eating, their social structure plays a role in how intelligent they are. And then the last part is, how is this related to human intelligence? So humans do all kinds of different things. We know that humans have adapted to different environments, but what does it mean for our intelligence? I thought I would start with the bonobos. The bonobos are part of the genus Pan. They're found in Africa, and they are one of the chimpanzee species. You might not have heard much about them. They are very rare, and there are very few of them in captivity. One of my very first field trips, though, was to go into Central Africa and observe the bonobos. So I thought that would be a good place to begin here today. We find them in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can see that's right here in the central part of Africa. It is a very tropical region. It is the only country where you will find bonobos in the wild. And here is the Congo River that is dividing them from over here. There will be gorillas and chimpanzees over there, but the bonobos live in this region. No gorillas or chimpanzees overlap where the bonobos are. The site that I went to is approximately right here. It's a place called Wamba, and it was a site that the Japanese researchers had begun, and I joined them initially in my studies and traveled with them, and they had set up a site there. This is dense tropical rainforest, and it's lowland rainforest, so it rains a lot. It rains almost every day, even in the dry season. Every 2 to 3 days it does rain. But then as you fly over it, as you see in this picture, it really looks like a green velvet carpet out there. And you have these rivers that bisect it and cut it into different sections. And apes can't swim. And so that this separates communities of the apes many times. In this particular area, it is just the bonobos that live there. When you're on the ground, it looks a little bit different. It is quite dense. It doesn't look as flat when you're on the ground, and certainly when you're walking it, it doesn't feel as flat. So here I was standing on a ridge and I'm looking out across kind of a valley. There was a stream down here, that's where it's darker. And then gradually the land rises to another ridge over here. And so during the course of a day, I often walked 15 or more kilometers, but a lot of it was up and down. It wasn't nice and flat like it looked like when I was first flying over it. So I was looking for intelligence and I wanted to understand something about object manipulation and tool use. And so I set out to study tool use. The first reports coming out of the bonobo research was that they weren't really using many tools. We knew that from Jane Goodall that chimpanzees use tools, that they make tools, and she was finding lots of different ways they did. And that's what I wanted to understand in the bonobos. I had already been studying them a little bit in captivity, and I knew that they could make tools because they did in the zoo. But when I went into the wild, I didn't find a lot of tool use, and we're still trying to understand some of why they don't use as many tools. One thing seems to be about food, and that the chimpanzees have a greater need to find foods, that the rainforest where the bonobos live has more food available to them, and they don't need to make tools as much. I did find some tool use though, and things such as these rain hats over here on the left. And there's my pen, so you get a little feel for what size they are. And the bonobos will hold these over their head like little umbrellas. Sometimes they'll put 2 or 3 of them on their head and shoulders, and it really does help with some of the pounding of the rain that they really cannot escape, that can be quite painful at times too. Orangutans will make rain hats as well, but chimpanzees and gorillas don't. Here, another behavior that I found where they're using tools, and it's called branch dragging. And they branch drag, they pull the branch behind them. It seems really simple on the surface, but I discovered that it actually has a lot of meaning. And it's a communicative gesture where they're using it to keep their group together. And bonobos tend to stay in large groups. And so there could be 20 or 30 individuals kind of scattered around, fairly organized in a way. And they would travel to another feeding place, then they would go to another one, and that's where they might build their nests. And in the next morning, they're going to get up and feed again. But when they're moving through the forest, that's really dense vegetation, and it's hard to see more than really just a 2 or 3 feet. But by branch dragging, particularly the males would use this to direct the group in a particular direction. And I did lots of data collection on this and found it was really a very complex communicative device that incorporated a tool for them to use. But while I was studying things such as tool use, I always found that I was drawn to the personalities of the individuals. And when I think back on some of my time in the field now, those are the things I remember more than anything else. The different individuals, what their stories were, and who these individuals were in their own right. So here are a couple that I want to introduce you to. On the left, that's a young adult male. His name was Tawashi. And over here on the right is his big brother, actually, whose name was Moan. Both of them are looking at me as I looked at them. We did not hide from them. They knew we were there, but they had become accustomed to us. We use the term habituate, that they had become habituated to human observers. And so they allowed us to follow them and to observe them. For the most part, they were able to lose us out in the forest, and it might be a couple of days before we would find them again. But most of the time, we could follow them. And these two were a couple of my favorites. You can see here, particularly Moan seemed to have quite a sense of humor, and he was always finding funny postures to relax in or to watch us in. Some of the others, here is an adult female with a youngster. This is a 2-year-old infant that's on her back, and that's how they ride once they get a little bit bigger. Early on, they're going to be on the mother's belly, but as they get old enough, they'll ride on her back. Here is the alpha male of one of the groups. His name was Sen. He had his mother in the group still. He had a younger brother in the group, but he was the dominant male. And that meant he got to make a lot of the decisions about where they would go and what they were doing. He got to sit in the center of the group and have access to the best fruit tree sometimes. We didn't see a lot of fighting in bonobos. We just do not, as sometimes in chimpanzees or gorillas you do. But in bonobos, you really don't. They're more interested in that cohesion of the group. And that's what I link some of that branch dragging to, is the cohesiveness of their group. Here are some pictures of mothers with their babies. I found myself very drawn to mothers and infants. I actually started my career watching infant monkeys and then later infant chimpanzees. Both of those were in captivity. So when I first went to the field, it was sort of probably obvious I would be drawn to that eventually. And here you see some different pictures. Here's an infant with her mother that she's trying to get some food from her mother. She's got her hand up here begging food. Here is a mother with two of her offspring, an older daughter who's an adolescent, and her new little, well, 1.5-year-old infant here. He's also got his hand up. Mothers don't share a lot of food, but they allow their infants to take food. So it's not like they're going to take a piece of fruit and break it in half and hand half of it to their infant the way we might, but they allow their infant to take food. And she might even peel it first and then kind of spit it out into their hand. And so that's a gesture for begging that infants make a lot. Here we have a group of infants, and two that are about 3 and 4 years old. Their mothers are right here, and they're in a play group. This female has a fairly new infant. That one was only 3 months old, so it's never even left its mother's body yet at this point. The older infants are really interested. They'd like to play with the little one, but the mother is really kind of fending them off just a bit and teasing them and playing with them herself because she's not ready for them to play with her little infant. And it'll be several months yet before it's able to really join a play group such as this. So I thought I'd tell you a story about one of the young bonobos that I got to know, and I found some very interesting things going on with him. His name was Balau, and his mother was Bala, and this is them right here in the back of this picture. Balau is the youngster right here, and this is his mother, Bala. Bala gave birth when Balau was only 3 years old. That's very, very young. At 3 years old, a bonobo is usually still nursing. And a few minutes ago, I mentioned how long an infant ape might nurse. In bonobos, it's often as much as 5 years that they will be nursing from their mothers. That's really important for them to get the proper nutrition, to get the proteins and the fats that they need. When you're eating a diet of fruit, it doesn't have a lot of the protein and fats that you need. And the bigger your brain is, the more of those that you need. And so for the apes, it's really, really important. And that bond between the mother and the infant is quite strong. And the infant's survival really depends on it. But Bala gave birth to another baby. And if you look very carefully in this picture, right here, there's another little hand there. There's a new baby that mother is carrying and that she is nursing that new infant. And then she stops nursing her older one. But he was so young still. All of his age mates were still nursing, still riding on their mother's backs, but Bala didn't let him anymore. And so it was almost like he was an orphan. Now she is comforting him here. She is grooming him and helping him to relax and still keeping some of the bond, but he was no longer nursing with her. He had to move on his own. He had to get food, but he was still part of the group. And what I found was that the males in the group were taking care of him. And this male sitting right here in the center, he was an older male, really one of the grandfatherly types, one of my favorites, but he was one of the ones that was taking care of Balau. They would take turns. There were about 5 of them, but they would take turns, and sometimes they would carry him. If he was getting lost behind the group, they would stop and help him along. They would let him climb into the fruit tree with them. I saw him that he would sleep in a day nest for a nap with them, and so that they could help keep him warm if it was raining. And they really took over much of that care that his mother normally would be doing, but because she had a new baby, she could not give him the same care. A couple of years later, when I returned, he had grown up a bit more and he was very active with the other juveniles. And at that point, you couldn't tell that anything different had gone on when he was younger. But we were concerned at first that he wasn't going to survive because when the mother gives birth too close together, she doesn't have enough energy to take care of both of them. All right, let's move on then to some of the gorillas and chimpanzees. And these I studied in Cameroon. Cameroon is just to the west of Zaire, and it's right over here. And it's primarily in the southern parts of Cameroon that we find them, in the more tropical zones. If you go north in Cameroon, it turns into a lot of desert. In parts of the areas we find chimpanzees and gorillas living in the same areas. I visited or observed them in a few different areas. I did some work over here in this area. I was down right over here along the coast a little bit. I went in here to the Jaw Forest, a big reserve where chimpanzees and gorillas live. And I spent a full month down here. I was really looking for a new site that I might be able to start up some research. I ended up doing some different things, but I was able to make some comparisons and see all kinds of different things going on. Here is a West African chimpanzee up in a tree. You need big trees for gorillas because gorillas get to be quite big. Chimpanzees are smaller than gorillas, but they're big enough. And here's a mother with her infant, and they're in a fig tree. These are figs here. There are lots of different species of figs, but the apes really, really like figs. And if there are trees around with figs, you can almost always find one of the apes that live in the area up there feeding on them. So with the chimpanzees, it is, of course, Jane Goodall who made them quite famous. This is one of the most iconic pictures around. And here is baby Flint reaching out and touching Jane's hand. She taught us a lot about infants and their mothers and how important the bond between a mother and an infant really is. She taught us about the social structure and how the males are closely bonded to each other in chimpanzees, and they stay all of their life in a single group with their brothers and their uncles and their father. They don't know who their father is, but they're all related to each other. And that's forming really a very important part of the social group. Females will typically leave the group in chimpanzees and live in a different group the rest of their lives. Sometimes they'll stay in their birth group. Here we have a small group up in a tree. You've got a male, here's a female and a youngster, not an infant any longer, but still following his mother. And they're looking off at something, not sure what, but they travel in these small parties. So they have a large community, but they do tend to be more in smaller groups than we see with the bonobos. So some mothers and offspring here. What are the mothers doing? Certainly they're nursing their babies. So here I think we have Flo, and here's Fifi, her juvenile, and here's Flint, that infant I was just talking about. And Fifi liked to help take care of her baby brother. When her baby brother was born, though, she had temper tantrums because her mother wouldn't take care of her. But she was already about 5 or 6 years old when Flint was born, and she managed to do quite well. In fact, she was one of the most prolific chimpanzees ever known at Gombe. She was very strong. She had 9 babies in her life, and her strong mother gave her that opportunity. So we learned a tremendous amount about different mothering styles and how Flo was such a good mother. Here we see a youngster with his mother, and what she's doing is actually using a tool. She is using this tool that she has made. She's stripped the leaves off of it. She's fixed the end just right, and she's at a termite nest, and she's poking her stick into those termite mounds, and when she pulls it out, she can pull off the termites to eat. Insects provide a tremendous amount of protein as well as fats that you don't get from the fruit. And here her infant is watching her, taking a little break from watching, but he often will peer very closely and he will learn, but it's slow learning. She doesn't really teach him. She doesn't take his hands and shape them, but she lets him watch her. And sometimes she'll do it a bit slower. And so it's a process. It can take many years to learn. One of the things that the apes have to do is watch their mothers so that they know what to do when they're grown up. When I was in Cameroon, I did get out into the field and saw some chimpanzees, but one of my favorite stories is about this infant right here. I ended up doing a lot of rescue work. There's a lot of hunting of chimpanzees still, gorillas as well, and this was a rescue center I found. I was taking some students out into Cameroon with me, and they ended up volunteering here. These are young baby chimpanzees. They've lost their mothers. They've been confiscated by the police and now put into this rescuer rehabilitation center, and they get to grow up there, and some of them may get to go back into the forest someday. Not all of them, but some of them do. It was Seiko I got to know best. I had been out in the forest, and as I came out of the forest after a month out there was a small village, and in that village, they had just confiscated a baby chimpanzee from the hunter. And that was good, because although the hunting was bad, we didn't want him to sell the infant, because he could get quite a bit of money, more money than he could get for other things. And that would be a reward for his hunting. And so we were really trying to stop the hunting. But then the villagers didn't know what to do with the infant now. They were taking care of it and feeding him, but they really didn't have the ability to truly take care of it. I knew of this rescue center because I'd been doing some work there. And so along with somebody else, we took Seiko and we took him back to the city and then eventually down to Limbe, where the rescue center was located. He had some shrapnel in his arm from the bullet that killed his mother, but his arm was not broken. We had a doctor look at it. And then when we took him here, we put him in this group where the other young chimpanzees were so that he could start to make friends. It took a while. I took him every night and he slept with me. I cared for him for about 2 weeks. And gradually I got him used to being in the group. And so I could gradually leave him there. And after about 2 weeks, I was able to do that and return to my own work. But he was doing quite well the last time I heard from them. It's been a few years since I've kept in contact with them, but he was doing well and growing into a big chimpanzee. Gorillas are big. They are the largest of all the primates. We have two different species of them, both in Africa, but in different parts of Africa. We have the Western lowland gorillas, or gorilla, and we have the mountain gorillas, or gorilla barenge. And these are the ones that Dian Fossey made quite famous. They live in the Virunga volcanoes of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Uganda. It's a very tiny area. The lowland gorillas live primarily in the western parts of Africa, and those are the ones I met out in the field. And this is the one I wanted to share a story with you about. And this is Maxie. Maxie was 6 months old when I met her. She was also in this rescue center that I was just talking about. She was the first gorilla I ever got to hold, and the first one who really taught me some of the difference between what it is to be a chimpanzee and what it is to be a gorilla. They walk a bit different, they play differently, but one of the first things I learned was that they laugh differently. The apes love to be tickled, and when you get one of these infants, you can poke them in different ways and they start laughing. A chimpanzee has a very throaty sort of laugh, but a gorilla, Maxie giggled when I tickled her. It's a very deep giggle that if I try to do it, I would end up coughing, but it's really deep in her throat, and it's very different than the chimpanzee laugh. But she was only 6 months old here. She was so tiny. She didn't play very well with the chimpanzees. They really didn't want to play with her. Partly she was too young, but partly she just played differently. And so I spent a lot of time where I could helping her out and holding her and just giving her comfort that her mother would have given her. We were feeding them bottles, teaching them how to eat other foods and getting them to try new things, and just keeping them safe. Maxie had come to the research facility when she was just 6 weeks old. And so she was doing quite well at this time when I got to first see her and to hold her and to take care of her. Her mother had been killed, just as Seiko's mother had been killed. And the mother's meat tends to go into a black market for food. Many people still eat these apes, but it is against the law, so it is part of a black market. But then they do try to sell the infants as pets or to tourists sometimes. It's a very difficult thing to see because most of them don't survive. Only with these rescue centers do they really have a chance of surviving. And so we were able to get Maxie down to the rescue center, and she was doing quite well. Gorillas are a little harder to take care of than the chimpanzees are. Chimpanzees are a bit closer to humans, so a little easier to deal with. But the last time I saw Maxie, she wasn't doing so well. She had gotten a parasite, an intestinal parasite, which was very common there. And she eventually did die from that. After I left her, I received a letter from them telling me that she had passed. I actually had the same parasite when I came back home to the United States as well. But I was able to get medical care that just wasn't available for her. And she was so tiny that she did not survive. But I use her story to help tell people about what it is to be a gorilla and how sad it can be when we try to rescue these individuals and they don't always do very well. These are the orangutans, and they're the last apes that I went out to study. And only 3 years ago, I was out in Borneo where I was able to observe some orangutans. Borneo's in Southeast Asia. This is the only great ape that lives there. And Borneo is part of the country of Indonesia, as well as partly of Malaysia. I was on the Indonesian side. And there's another island here called Sumatra. And these are the only two places you'll find orangutans in the wild. There are two different species that live there, but this is Pongo pygmaeus, the Bornean orangutan, and I got to meet some of them. I joined a friend of mine who had been studying orangutans for a long time, and she had set up this research site in Kutai National Park, this little green spot right here. So not a very large national park, but the orangutans are somewhat protected there. She had built a camp where we stayed, and these are two of the little guys I got to know there. So about a 5-year-old, and this is a 2-year-old. And he's the one I'm going to tell you a story about. We named him Jarwo. Jarwo locally means, it's a name given to young boys. It means to take the strong path. He had a sad story to begin with as well. I met Jarwo because his mother had died. She was not killed by somebody. She had died, and we found her body. But we knew that this female had an infant, but we didn't find him right away. It was a couple of days before we found him. But we eventually did, and we were very, very concerned. He was only 2 years old. That's very little. Orangutans actually have the longest time between giving birth. It might be as much as 8 years between when a mother gives birth to one infant before she gives birth to another. They're much more solitary than either the gorillas or the chimpanzees are. And there's never anybody else there to help take care of an infant. So the infant has to learn everything from its mother, and it's a slow process. She might nurse the infant for as many as 5 or 6 years. And Jarwo at 2 years old would have still been nursing. He still had a lot to learn, and we were very, very worried about him. And so what we did was we actually arranged for him to be brought into a rescue center, and they had to come and capture him to take him there. But between the time when we found him and before they could get there, because they couldn't come immediately, we were concerned for his survival. And so we guarded him basically. We went out first thing in the morning until last thing in the afternoon when he went to sleep, and we watched him. And what we found out was rather surprising. He actually was not despairing. He was not crying. He was doing what he had to do. And that's why we gave him the name Jarwo. He was eating food. He never wandered very far actually from where his mother had died, and her body was still there. Scavengers had started to eat the body of his mother. We never saw him approach it, but he stayed in the area. There were fig trees there. So I was talking about figs a moment ago, and here he is in the center in a fig tree. There's some of the figs growing along there. Some figs grow on vines. They grow in different ways, but these are some that grow like this. And so Jarwo was eating figs. He would get up in the morning sometime after dawn, and he would move into one of the trees to feed. And then he might take a nap. He came onto the ground at one point, and he went out into this field that was next to the trees, and he ate all of these herbs that were there. And you can see he has quite a large belly. He had been eating most of the day at this point. But we also think he might have had some parasites in his belly. We don't know what caused his mother's death, but he's not nursing at this point, so he's not getting the protein that is necessary, and that can sometimes make the belly get bigger. It's also probably why he was eating so much. He was hungry, but not getting all of the nutrition he needed. But he knew what to eat. He knew where to find it. He climbed in the trees. He walked along the ground between trees. He went out into the herbs, and he ate a bunch of those. When he needed to rest, he went back into the tree. And each night, he'd made a new nest. At 2 years old, he was already making nests. I have seen 4 and 5-year-olds in chimpanzees and bonobos who were not very good yet at making nests, but Jarwo was making them, and he made a new one each night. They were small nests, but he stayed in it all night long. He didn't try to get out of it. That would have been very, very dangerous if he did, because there were several things that lived in the area that would have potentially killed him and eaten him. And so we were able to watch him for a few days before the rescue people were able to arrive. But they did, and they were able to get a hold of him and bring him into captivity. And they took him to their rescue center, which is known as the Bornean Orangutan Survival Foundation. And there he went through initially quarantined to make sure he wasn't bringing any disease in, but he got back onto milk. He got human caretaking. They then bring them into a kindergarten stage where they learn different skills that they need, and they gradually grow up through these different sort of classes of schooling. We call it forest schools. And eventually they've learned how to be an orangutan. They know what to do, and they try to release them out into the wild, such as we see here. This is an adult being released into the wild to spend the rest of their life there. I recently, just in the last month, had some communication with them, and Jarwa is doing really, really well now. He has moved up into the next stage. He's no longer in kindergarten, and he always knows where to be. He knows how to climb the trees, and he's eating well. They don't have to give him a lot of teaching because he still knows what to do. He had learned already from his mother, and he's remembering that. He does need to get bigger, another maybe 3 years before they'll be able to release him back into the wild somewhere. But he's going to survive, and he's doing really, really well. So I keep saying that these guys are really endangered, and there's all kinds of things that are threatening them. We see logging as one of the threats, where they clear cut the forest and sell the trees. Here, one of the ancient trees in the forest has been cut down. That's my colleague standing there right next to the base of the tree. That was within the national park. You can see the poachers got caught. And so we think about poachers as killing animals, but we talk about them poaching trees as well. But this was one of the really ancient trees, and now it's destroyed. Palm oil. This is one of the real problems. They cut down the forest and they're making palm oil plantation. There are all kinds of fires. Sometimes these are set by people to bring the trees down to burn the forest so that they can turn it into cropland. And sometimes it could be a lightning strike. But here is a male orangutan. You can see his forest is filled with fire here. Population growth, human population. We need more and more space for people all the time, and for people's foods to grow. We have to think about what's happening here. There is the hunting that goes on so that people still eat them. They try to sell the babies. The babies are adorable, and they get part of this illegal pet trade, which is still going on. And many, many of these infants do not survive this. And you saw how many were coming into the rescue centers. There's no forest really to put them back into now. So the future for all of these apes, it really depends on us. If I've moved you with my stories of these young guys, that was one of my purposes here, to see how special they are and how much we need to do to help them. We have to support conservation efforts. I want you to share their stories. I want you to avoid all palm oil products. Many of our cookies and our cakes, our crackers, shampoos, they're all made from palm oil, or at least they have palm oil in them. And the more of these products that we buy, the more they're going to cut down trees to grow palm oil. And so we have to avoid them. We want to seek out sustainably grown products, whether it's our coffee and our tea, whether it is eating of meat. Is it sustainable? Is it sustainable palm oil? Some places it is, but not everywhere. We have to support anti-poverty efforts. That's why some people are killing them. That's why some people are cutting down the forest. That's why they're trying to engage in the pet trade, is because they have no income of their own. And there's so much world poverty that this is really, really a problem. And we have to practice daily conservation, each one of us. It does make a difference. Don't use more than you need, not just what you want, but how much do you actually need? Keep it as small as possible, whether we're talking about food, electricity, fuel, paper, recycle anything that you can. Don't buy more than you need, and help others become aware. Again, sharing stories. I want to leave you, this is a link to a short video. I'm not going to show it to you now. I'll ask that your teachers do that for you. It's a very short video, but it's looking at these conservation efforts and thinking about the story of the infant orangutans in this case. So here's the link to it. It's a YouTube video, very, very sweet story and moving story for you. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for your attention. I hope I have a chance to meet you and maybe talk to you in person, or almost in person these days. And please enjoy going through my presentation and the pictures if you want to do it again. And I'll say goodbye now. See you again.